Case study number 2, endotoxins. Endotoxins are these polysaccharide secretions that come out of bacteria that feast on little bits and pieces that come off of cockroaches and pets and other things. And they cause asthmatic response and other allergic responses. And so there was a lot of focus on this. And so in this study, they very similar study design, integrative samplers. There's no real-time endotoxin monitor even today. Stationary indoors, stationary outdoors, personal. This is a log scale now for endotoxin concentration. And so the personal was 2 orders of magnitude above the indoors or the outdoors, even though the source of these endotoxins was largely coming in this cohort, was largely coming from the indoor location because that's where they spent all their time. These people never really. And so the idea here is that just by moving about your house, you have this resuspension cloud and you have this personal cloud of particles. And those endotoxins are enriched in that because they're in the larger PM10 particles. And so that was their explanation for why this was so much higher on the personal than in the indoor or the outdoor. Next slide. And it mattered for lung function. If you looked at the indoor concentrations versus lung function, so indoor concentrations versus lung function, you'd say more endotoxins are good for your lung function. But if you looked at the personal, you saw that more endotoxins was worse for your lung function, and that makes a lot more sense. So massive exposure misclassification from relying on even indoor air monitoring for an indoor source. This is one of the stepchilds for personal monitoring, or the poster childs for personal monitoring. Next slide. So how am I doing on time, Dan? Yeah, we'll do the group activity after lunch. Okay, so so household air pollution is the other real poster child for why personal monitoring in health studies is really important, because the source is so large and there's so much vertical and horizontal variability next to it. And also because when we cook, we don't cook the same way exactly every single day, right? Lots of things determine how we interact with the fire, what we cook, our mood of the day, how tired we are. And so one of the other important things is the need for those repeated measurements that I talked about before. If in a health study for chronic outcomes, you want to estimate long-term exposure. Next slide, please. And so here's the case study. This came from a postdoc who went to Rwanda when the military was doing a stove intervention. The military was installing stoves in people's kitchens. In this part of Rwanda, the kitchens were a separate dwelling. It was just a small room enclosed, and people were cooking indoors with no chimney, with solid fuels. And the levels were horrendously high. The engineer who went was able to show the military that they weren't installing the stoves correctly. They listened to her and they started installing them better. And boy, the concentrations go down. Inside a fixed site kitchen area monitor in the exact same height and location relative to fire was reduced by 90%. Unfortunately, it was still high. It was 100 micrograms per cubic meter, but it was no longer milligrams per cubic meter, right? It was so much better. What do you think the effect was on the personal monitor? Did it go down Did it go up? Did it stay the same? How many people want to vote that it went down? The kitchen went down by 90%. Who's going to vote that it went down? Boy, you know the punchline is coming. Who wants to say that it's going to stay the same? Raise your hands. Okay. Who wants to say it went up? Raise your hands. Boy, nobody's raising their hands. I think we all need to stand up and do some jumping jacks. Okay. Next slide. Went up by 50%. Why? She went and interviewed the women, and the women said, well, you know, before it was so bad, I would just run in, throw the food on, and run out. I was in the kitchen, 2 minutes for a meal. Start the fire, put the pot on, throw the food on, get out. I didn't care. Now, the kitchen was a nice place to be. They actually spent a lot of time in the kitchen, a couple hours a day. The food tasted a lot better. Their husbands were happier with them, but their personal exposure went up. Now, unfortunately, this postdoc left Columbia and never published this story because it's such a great story. Next slide. So these are my conclusions. We'll break for lunch and we'll come back and do group activity. So personal exposure assessment can identify significant exposures not seen in ambient monitoring or not even seen in indoor monitoring, and thus can avoid many forms of exposure misclassification. It is especially important when people are close to the point source of exposure, where there's these large spatial and temporal variabilities that aren't captured well by fixed site monitoring. However, it's expensive and currently can really only be done for between 24 and 72 hours. Even with these small devices, to keep them light enough weight, the batteries just can't be that big. You could go a little bit longer if you plugged it in at night, but then you're relying on the participants to plug them in. Some participants do that well. Lots of participants aren't very good at plugging things in at night. Calibration of these low-cost PM sensors that are being built into not only ambient monitors, but personal monitors is really important. And currently, our best method is to collect a filter at the same time, so co-located on the person, and weigh it, and then correct it to the average. Wearing compliance for personal monitoring studies is really important, and really important that it be done objectively. And anyone creating new personal monitors should always put an accelerometer. It's a dirt cheap little chip and adds so much. And repeated measurements are important for estimating long-term exposure if you're doing personal monitoring, right? That's the weakness of personal monitoring, is you're only looking at these small snapshots, where with an ambient monitor, you can do it for a year at a time. So that's the big trade-off between the two. Well, thank you. Any questions? Oh, yes.
What distance with the mouth or the nose as the radius are we supposed to measure exposure through the breathing zone?
So, yeah, the literature talks about being within the breathing zone. So there's some flexibility depending on what you're really interested in and what study. For household air pollution, it's really important to be pretty close because of that vertical variation and depending on whether the woman's bending over or not. Other studies for PM 2.5, where you're not so close to the point source, it might be okay to wear it on the down here on the waist because the PM 2.5 is relatively well mixed as long as you're not super close to that point source. PM 10, on the other hand, because it settles out so quickly, there again, you want to be very close to the breathing zone. So, you know, the rule of thumb is within 2 feet, but it really depends on what the sources are that you're really interested in or think might exist. And of course, if you're doing this study where you're just trying to check it compared to ambient, you don't know what the source is that you might be missing. So it's always, you know, it's good when possible to have it up on the chest. But there are cases where I've done studies at the waist because it was the only way that the cohort would wear it. And we thought it wouldn't be that bad.